Everything began like any other ordinary flight. Passengers took their seats one by one. The familiar hum of the engines filled the cabin as the airplane left the ground and ascended into the vast sky. But no one could have predicted that just a few minutes later, a moment would change a young boy's life forever. Jaylen Rivers, 17 years old, was flying alone for the first time. For him, sitting in first class was a long-cherished dream. After weeks of saving every penny he had, finally upgraded his seat on his own, not by luck but through relentless effort, he settled into the wide leather seat, feeling the tranquility and space. Everything felt like a dream. For the first time, Jaylen felt like he truly belonged. No longer invisible, squeezed into the back rows. Here, he was valued. But that feeling of pride didn't last long. A flight attendant walked up to him. Her demeanor was friendly, but her gaze betrayed a sense of scrutiny. She quickly glanced at the ticket in Jaylen's hand, then lifted her eyes slowly, scanning his face. "Sorry, you're not supposed to sit here," she said, her voice still gentle but tinged with caution. Jaylen was stunned. He looked around and noticed that none of the other first-class passengers seemed to notice the conversation happening. "I upgraded my seat," Jaylen said, his voice trembling with nervousness. "I paid for this seat myself." Heather Dalton raised an eyebrow, her smile fading. "This area is reserved for passengers who have paid for the appropriate tickets," she said flatly. "And you don't seem like someone who should be sitting here." Jaylen stood frozen as if time had suddenly stopped. "What do you mean by that?" Jaylen asked, his voice steadier. "Now, I have a ticket I upgraded properly. Why am I being asked to leave?" The flight attendant glanced at her colleagues, exchanging meaningful looks. Then she turned back, trying to muster a polite smile. "I'm sorry, but I must ask you to move to economy class. There are still plenty of seats available there." A wave of emotion surged within Jaylen. He felt the eyes of everyone on him, but no one spoke. He clenched his fists, his breath quickening. Everything felt like a nightmare, but he knew this was not the moment to back down. "Why is this happening?" Jaylen asked, his voice now shaking with anger. "I have a valid ticket, so why am I being asked to leave?" Heather avoided his gaze and answered quickly, "I'm just following the rules." Her voice faltered as if she was trying to escape the awkward situation. Jaylen bit his lip. He couldn't let this go. He thought of one person, someone who could make all the difference. Without hesitation, he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and quickly dialed the familiar number. His heart raced as the ringtone began. At first, Heather remained indifferent. But then, as she heard Jaylen speaking on the phone, her expression began to change. Her eyes flickered with a vague sense of worry, but Jaylen kept looking straight ahead, calm. He had made the call. The machine was in motion. No one knew that this phone call would create a ripple that would shake the skies. Jaylen could clearly feel Heather Dalton's icy stare. Her posture had stiffened, her face tight with pressure. But now there was no turning back. He had made the calla move he never thought he'd have the courage to make. And now there was only a slim hope that the person on the other end would hear and speak up for him. The ringing continued, each tone seeming to pull memories back to the surface. The endless days of hard work, every penny he had saved, the quiet sacrifices just to be able to sit in first class. But now, all of that seemed to be suffocated by a bitter feeling as his self-respect was driven into the ground. This was no longer about a seat. It was about dignity, the feeling of being recognized, the right to be treated fairly. Suddenly, a deep, assured voice came through the other end of the line. "Yeah, it's me." Jaylen took a deep breath. "Uncle Langston, it's me. I'm on the plane, and I really need your help." A long pause, then Mr. Langston's voice came through without hesitation. "What's going on?" Jaylen gripped the phone tightly, keeping his voice steady. "I've been kicked out of first class. I paid for this seat, but the flight attendant says I don't belong here. Uncle, can you help me?" On the other end, a heavy silence hung in the air. Jaylen thought the call had ended until the voice came through again, more forceful than before. "Which airline are you flying with? Where are you going?" Jaylen quickly provided all the details of the flight and the airline Northwind Air. Everything was happening too fast, and yet it felt so real. He couldn't believe he was in a situation that he had only ever seen online or in the news. But he trusted Mr. Langston. If anyone could change the situation, it was him. "You did the right thing by calling me," Mr. Langston said firmly. "Stay calm. Don't let them scare you. Stay right where you are. Don't back down. I'll handle the rest." Jaylen was about to respond, but just then the signal cut off. The call ended. He stared at the phone screen, his mind torn between relief and anxiety. Had he done the right thing? Would that call be enough to turn things around, or would it make everything worse? Heather turned back her gaze colder than before. Jaylen stood up, his eyes full of determination. He was no longer the shy boy from just a few minutes ago. He was someone who had chosen to stand up for what was right. Just as he was about to speak, his phone vibrated. A new message from Mr. Langston. "I've made initial contact. Stay strong." Just a few words, but enough to give him strength. Jaylen felt a surge of energy. Mr. Langston was not just a powerful figure. He was the one who turned dreams into action, and he was behind Jaylen. Heather was now losing her patience. "Are you going to leave, or should I call security?" Her voice was cold, no longer holding any patience. Jaylen lifted his head, his eyes steady. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I haven't done anything wrong, and someone representing me has contacted the airline's management. If you want to call anyone, feel free. I'm staying right here." Heather froze. She wasn't used to such resistance. She had seen hundreds of passengers lower their heads and leave reluctantly. But this time, the teenager in front of her was not like the others. She glanced around the cabin, the air tight as a drawn bowstring. Something had changed. Not just a boy daring to speak up, but that boy was being backed up. Then Jaylen's phone vibrated once again, a signal that this battle was far from over. Another notification appeared on Jaylen's phone screen. This time it was from Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Langston's close friend. "It's done. They're taking you off the plane." Jaylen read the message with his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe his eyes. Each word seemed to stir up a storm of emotions within him. Before he could even process what was happening, Heather Dalton suddenly turned around and walked quickly toward the front of the cabin with an unusual air of firmness. Just a few minutes later, another crew member rushed into the cabin whispering something into Heather's ear. From the look in their eyes, Jaylen knew something big was about to happen, but he still couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of it. Suddenly, the plane jolted slightly. The seatbelt sign lit up. A voice from the cockpit came over the intercom, steady and calm. "We're experiencing a minor technical issue and will be returning to the gate." Jaylen felt a heavy pressure settle in his chest. What just happened? What is really going on? The flight attendants quickly moved down the aisle, their faces tense. They instructed all passengers to remain seated and fasten their seat belts. Meanwhile, Jaylen remained frozen in place as if caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Everything still felt too vague, but he knew this was no longer just about a first-class seat. This was the truth being exposed. The airplane slowly rolled back toward the gate, and strangely, instead of fear or anxiety, Jaylen felt something resembling satisfaction. He had stood up, he had not stayed silent, and that had made a difference. The plane's wheels hit the tarmac with a heavy thud. An unwelcome return, passengers began to murmur. Sitting uneasily, everyone wondered why the flight, which had just started, was now turning back. No one spoke to him, but Jaylen remained still, gripping his phone tightly. He looked straight ahead, ignoring the curious glances. No need for explanations. Not now. He reopened the message from Mr. Whitmore. The words were still there. "It's done. They're taking you off the plane." And just then, the door at the front of the plane opened. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin. Two men walked in, both dressed in sharp suits, their gazes piercing. They didn't look like any of Northwind Air's regular staff that Jaylen had seen before. These were people from the upper echelons, the kind that only appeared when there was a serious matter to handle. One of the men lowered his head and whispered something to the flight crew. The attendants immediately changed their expressions. Soon after, one of the attendants, the one who had avoided the situation earlier, came to Jaylen's row. She didn't say anything, just stood there looking at him with an apologetic gaze. Then the voice from the suited man spoke. "Son," he said, his tone deep and firm. "Could you come with us?" Jaylen looked up, his eyes full of worry. Am I in trouble?" The man shook his head, his seriousness mixed with a hint of regret. "No, not at all. Everything will be fine, but we need to speak with you privately." "Not here." Jaylen stood up, still holding his phone tightly. Though he didn't know what awaited him outside, he knew that he couldn't go back to what he had been before. And this time, he wasn't backing down. His footsteps echoed down the aisle leading off the plane. Through the door leading to the jet bridge, Jaylen saw two more people waiting for him. A woman stood between them, holding a tablet. Her gaze tired but resolute. She didn't seem threatening or angry. She was simply someone trying to stay calm in the middle of a storm. Jaylen could guess this was likely someone high-ranking from Northwind Air. Then she stepped forward with determination, ready to speak. The woman stepped closer. Her gaze determined her demeanor, both polite and full of responsibility. "I'm Rachel Lynn Sr., Executive Director in charge of flight operations at Northwind Air." She introduced herself. "I'd like to take a moment to speak with you. This is important." Jaylen nodded slightly. She looked at him directly without evasion. "We regret to inform you that there has been an incident concerning your seat and the behavior of a member of the flight crew." Jaylen was surprised. "Really?" "Yes," he replied. "I have a confirmed seat in first class. The ticket is valid, but I was told that I don't belong there." Rachel did not take her eyes off him, her gaze understanding but still serious. "Did you call someone outside the airline?" "Yes," Jaylen answered plainly. She paused for a moment, then gently tapped on the tablet she held. After a deep breath, she continued. "The person you called connected directly with our senior operations team. That call was escalated all the way to the CEO's office." Jaylen's eyes widened. Although he knew Mr. Langston was an influential person, he hadn't expected the situation to escalate this far so quickly, decisively, and with such weight, Rachel continued, her voice steady but sincere. "We are taking this very seriously. If you have experienced any form of discrimination or mistreatment, you can be assured that we will investigate thoroughly. But right now, we need to decide if this flight can continue." Jaylen furrowed his brow, confused. "Is this my fault?" "No, absolutely not," she reassured him. "This is a matter concerning the system. You haven't done anything wrong. But once senior leadership has to intervene mid-flight, we are required to pause to follow the proper procedures." He turned his head and glanced back at the passenger cabin. The plane still hadn't moved. The air was thick with tension as passengers whispered anxiously, trying to understand why the flight was delayed. Rachel looked down at the screen once more, frowning. The flight was still being delayed. Everything stood still in the heavy silence. The word "delayed" echoed in Jaylen's mind like a thunderclap. Even now, he couldn't believe that a single phone call could turn an entire flight around. "I didn't expect it to go this far," he said softly. "I just wanted to keep the seat I paid for." Rachel nodded slowly, her eyes filled with deep sympathy. "And that's why this matters," she said. "You shouldn't have to fight just to sit in the seat you bought. We will find out the truth. And those who need to know will know." A long silence hung in the air. Then one of the two men stepped forward, leaning in to speak softly. "Could you spare a few minutes? Someone wants to meet with you privately." Jaylen nodded slightly, still in disbelief. He followed them out of the gate area each step, feeling like he was being led deeper into an unfamiliar reality. Just an hour ago, he was an ordinary passenger, and now he was caught in a storm he never saw coming. They led him to a quiet lounge behind a frosted glass door. When the door opened, Jaylen saw a man sitting at a table, speaking softly into a phone. He was dressed casually, but neatly, exuding calm and authority. As Jaylen entered, the man looked up, gave a slight smile, and hung up the phone. "I'm Clayton Moore," he introduced himself, his voice warm but clear. "I work in the Executive Relations Department at Northwind Air." Jaylen sat down, his mind still filled with worry. "Am I in trouble?" Clayton shook his head, his face showing clear disappointment. "It's not you," he said. "It's the airline. We're the ones in trouble." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Langston didn't go through customer service or the press. He called our CEO directly, on his personal number." Jaylen's eyes widened. He had never heard of anyone connecting directly with a CEO like that. Clayton nodded, his expression serious. "That's very rare, and when it happens, it means the airline has made a serious mistake." He opened a file and pushed a printed sheet toward Jaylen. "This is your confirmed ticket. Seat 3A, valid, fully paid, and recorded in our system." Jaylen breathed a sigh of relief and nodded. "I knew that I gave the ticket to the flight attendant, but she still wouldn't accept it." Clayton leaned back in his chair, his face heavy with concern. "The issue isn't just the seat," he said. "It's the prejudice that came with it. It's the way people looked at you and assumed you didn't belong there." A heavy silence fell over the space. Those words, though not loud, felt as heavy as stone, making Jaylen realize this was the moment when he was no longer the one quietly hurt. He was beginning to be heard. Clayton Moore paused for a moment before continuing his words, careful and thoughtful. "Right. Now I can't make a public statement." He began, his eyes still fixed on Jaylen. "But there's something I need to make clear. You're not the first to report that flight attendant. There's been a series of incidents, and now everything has gone beyond the limit. Jaylen's heart raced. He wasn't the only one who had experienced this feeling. There were others, silent, unheard. Clayton stood up, his gaze steady. "We will handle this. You'll be rebooked, upgraded to the correct seat. We'll take care of everything." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "But the most important thing is, you've created change." Jaylen slowly stood up. He was still overwhelmed. Everything had happened like a whirlwind. He looked at him hesitantly, asking, "What about the flight from earlier? Isn't it still grounded?" Clayton nodded. "The entire crew has been replaced. An official investigation begins today." Jaylen paused, but for the first time since that moment in the air, he felt a spark inside him. Not anger, but strength. He was no longer helpless. And this journey, it was far from over. As Jaylen left the executive lounge area, he noticed the atmosphere at the airport had changed dramatically. Staff wearing headsets were exchanging information quickly. A manager hurried through the terminal. 2 security guards were directing confused passengers from the canceled flight. He wasn't seeking attention, but the incident had made him the center of it. From a suspected passenger, Jaylen had now become the catalyst for a billion-dollar company to reevaluate itself. His phone buzzed in his hand. A new message from Mr. Langston. "Handled it. We'll talk when you land. I'm proud of you." Just a short line, but it wiped away any doubt in Jaylen's heart. He felt a clear sense of purpose, and this time nothing would shake him. At the check-in counter, a calm, professional female attendant approached him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rivers," she said gently. "We've arranged a direct flight for you in 2 hours. First-class seat, 1A. You'll be escorted to the premium lounge. No chaos, no awkward apologies. Everything was flowing smoothly as if the airline wanted him to vanish from public view, but Jaylen had no intention of disappearing. Not this time. The Horizon Lounge was spacious and quiet. Jaylen sat near the window, his gaze following the planes slowly taxiing down the runway. A deep sense of unease still lingered in him. He hadn't initiated this, but somehow he had become caught in the eye of the storm. A small noise echoed through the room. The door opened. A woman entered, dressed in a black blazer, holding a tablet and a sealed envelope. She sat down across from Jaylen. No pleasantries, no small talk. "I'm Sabrina Chen." She introduced herself. "I'm from the Legal and Internal Controls Department of Northwind Air." She placed the tablet on the table, her voice calm but serious. "You're not being forced to speak today, but we hope you'll share your account of the incident if you feel ready. Everything you say will be recorded for the official investigation." Jaylen looked up, his gaze probing. "A recorded statement." Sabrina nodded. "Yes, we are reviewing the entire incident. Your account will help us clarify the actions of the flight crew. You can refuse to answer any questions you're uncomfortable with." Jaylen nodded slightly. He didn't want to avoid it anymore. "All right," he replied. Sabrina pressed the record button. The air between them thickened. "Please state your full name." Jaylen said it clearly. "Can you describe in detail what happened from the moment you boarded the plane?" And so, for the first time, Jaylen told the whole story, from when he handed his ticket to the flight attendant, to the moment Heather Dalton looked at him and immediately became suspicious, then claimed there were no seats left, and how her attitude shifted when he refused to leave. Sabrina listened quietly, not interrupting, only asking a few clarifying questions. When he finished, she reached for the envelope. "We're reviewing the cabin video footage to support the investigation," she explained. "We're also gathering statements from passengers seated nearby. Jaylen looked at the envelope, a mixture of curiosity and unease rising in him. Jaylen looked at the envelope in his hands, still skeptical. He raised his head and asked quietly, "What's inside, Sabrina?" Chen replied in a deep voice, both professional and with a hint of emotion. "It's an official apology letter from the airline signed by Mr. Christopher Dean, the Vice President of Customer Relations. There's also a voucher and a letter stating that we are reviewing the entire situation. You can read it now or keep it for later." Jaylen took the envelope but didn't open it yet. He wasn't ready. Sabrina stood up, taking back the tablet, her tone softening. "Someone will contact you in the next few days. I understand, today's flight was nothing like you imagined." Jaylen bit his lip and replied briefly, "Not at all." Sabrina hesitated for a moment before saying, "What you did is meaningful. You're speaking up for the truth, is creating a ripple effect far beyond the boundaries of this airline. Many people are watching." As she left, Jaylen leaned back in his seat, his hand still gently holding the unopened envelope. He knew there was an apology inside compensation, and it seemed like enough. But for Jaylen, that wasn't enough, because the harm didn't come from a technical error or a seat. It came from the look, the silent judgment, from a system ready to suspect him before he even spoke, and only when the harm had been done did the apology come. Always too late, Jaylen's phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Whitmore. "The story is spreading. Check this link." Jaylen tapped on it, a viral post from a travel influencer sharing a quick video filmed inside the plane. Though the sound was unclear, the image was crystal clear. Heather Dalton, standing sternly, arms crossed, looking down at Jaylen with a judging stare. That tense atmosphere was captured without any commentary, and then the comments exploded. "Why is this still happening in today's world? He's really brave. Airlines need to change." Jaylen scrolled further. A major news outlet had picked up the story. It was no longer just his story. It had become a societal issue. Another message appeared, sending a chill down Jaylen's spine. "She's been suspended. Temporarily, the airline is launching an internal investigation." His finger paused on the screen. Not because of joy, not because of justice served, but because this wasn't about revenge. Jaylen had never done this for satisfaction. He just wanted someone to be held accountable. And now, that was really happening. The boarding call rang out in the distance. A new flight, a new journey. No one would scrutinize his ticket again. No eyes would doubt him. No underlying question about whether he belonged in that seat. As he entered the priority area, Jaylen paused briefly. A thought flashed through his mind. How many people had stayed silent instead of facing this? How many had quietly walked to the back of the plane or left entirely just to avoid trouble? How much pain had never been heard? He moved forward. The eyes of others were on him, but this time not in judgment, but in recognition, in witness. When the plane's wheels rolled down the runway and began to ascend, Jaylen sat still in seat 1A. That luxurious seat seemed to be enveloped in an invisible layer of air. He felt occasional glances cast his way. Not out of curiosity, not out of suspicion, but because they knew what had happened. The pilot's voice came on, greeting the passengers with the usual tone of any other flight. No mention of the airline having to cancel an entire flight due to misconduct. No one said a word. But Jaylen knew he was sitting in a quiet moment of history. He tilted his head back, eyes gazing up at the ceiling, The gentle hum of the engines wasn't enough to drown out the swirling thoughts in his mind, because it was that moment when someone looked at him, not because of his ticket, his appearance, or his actions, but simply looked at him and concluded he didn't belong there. That moment had pierced his heart. The plane landed smoothly. Jaylen turned his phone back on. Immediately, the notifications flooded in. A message from his friends. "Bro, you're all over the news. Check CNN, you're famous now." The world knew, and now Jaylen was at the center of it all. Jaylen's heart raced as he clicked the link sent to him. The news page loaded, and his face filled the screen. Everything was now real, official. The headline stood out boldly. Teenager asked to leave. First class, due to appearance. Airline. Immediately grounds flight for investigation. Below, a subheading explained the controversial video had gone viral across social media. Jaylen continued reading. The article talked about the growing concerns after the flight was delayed, the apology offered at the airport. But how it didn't quell the wave of anger, Northwind Air's legal department confirmed that an internal investigation was underway. Just a few hours had passed, but everything had already been thrust into an irreversible cycle. Jaylen's phone buzzed again. Strange numbers started popping up. "This is Diana from Morning Wave. We'd be honored if you would share your story with us. No edits, no distortions, just your truth." Jaylen stared at the screen, hesitated, then put the phone down. His heart felt heavy. Just a day ago, he was just a lonely teenager on his first flight alone. Now, the entire world seemed to be waiting to hear his story, and that made him feel alienated. Because for Jaylen, this wasn't a story at all. It was the truth. It was something that thousands of others still had to silently endure every day. It was the injustice everyone saw, but so few dared to speak out about. After retrieving his luggage, Jaylen stepped into the lobby. A man in a gray suit stood waiting by the exit. No greeting, no handshake, just a nod and a name tag on his chest, a senior representative from the very airline that had tried to dismiss him earlier that morning. "We've arranged for a private car to take you home," he said quickly. "An official letter will also be sent to your address. Once again, we apologize for the incident." Jaylen got into the car in silence. The silence was suffocating. Inside the car, he took out the envelope from Sabrina. He opened the letter. The letter was written in polished formal language. An apology that followed the standard procedure, acknowledging the failure in service, mentioning commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But not a word about prejudice, not a single mention. It was as if they were trying to avoid naming the real issue. There was just one line at the end that made Jaylen pause. "We will treat this as an opportunity to retrain the staff and better communicate the values that our airline strives for." Jaylen folded the letter, his gaze distant. To him, this wasn't about values. It was about that moment when someone had the chance to do the right thing, but chose to do the opposite. 2 days later, Jaylen agreed to participate in a single interview, not for fame, but to reclaim control of his own voice. If his name was going to be tied to this event, it would be on his own terms. The filming took place in a modest, clean studio. The interviewer, a woman with a calm demeanor, sat across from him, her gaze gentle yet full of respect. When she asked, "Why didn't you leave your seat when she asked you to?" Jaylen didn't hesitate. "Because I paid for that seat, because I have the right to sit there. If I left, it would mean I was admitting she was right, that I didn't belong there." The interviewer nodded. "Did you ever imagine things would go this far?" Jaylen replied, his voice steady. "I'm not looking for anything. I just didn't bow down." She looked at her notes. Many young people have gone through similar moments silently and unnoticed. What do you want to say to them? For the first time, Jaylen looked straight into the camera. You don't have to shout to make an impact. Anger isn't a prerequisite for speaking the truth. What matters is knowing who you are and not letting others' discomfort make you doubt yourself. The interview aired that evening, and within hours it spread across social media. The feedback flooded in. This kid is so brave. The way he stayed calm is incredible. One comment made Jaylen choke up. He's showing the kind of composure that many adults never learn. And then a miracle happened. Others started sharing their own stories. Through videos, posts, images, not just about this airline, but about the moments they had been rejected, doubted, looked down upon. A wave began to rise, not loud, but profound, and there was no sign of it stopping. That evening, another message quietly slipped through the silence. An internal memo had been leaked. The information revealed that the flight crew members involved were under their final review. Drafts of policy changes had already begun to be written. But Jaylen didn't speak up. He didn't post anything. Didn't share another video. Didn't react. Not because he was afraid, but because it had now crossed a personal boundary. This was no longer his story. It had become a mirror reflecting thousands of others who had to look at themselves. And this time, no one could turn away. The storm had risen, growing stronger by the hour, and every new story shared added weight to that wave. Jaylen had never sought the spotlight. But his courageous silence had sparked a conversation that couldn't be extinguished by corporate apologies or hollow statements from businesses. The name Jaylen Rivers spread across social media podcasts and news broadcasts. It wasn't just a name. It had become a symbol of resilience and silence of courage that didn't need to shout. Even those who hadn't heard the full story felt something deep when they mentioned his name. But amidst the whirlwind of public opinion, Jaylen was still just a teenager going to school, still facing math tests, writing essays, gym class, and the strange looks from classmates. Some people looked at him as if he were a celebrity. Others were cautious, unsure of what to say. One day, after school, Mr. Crawford, the history teacher, approached him with a concerned expression. "I just wanted to say how much I admired your interview," he said. "The way you kept your composure. It was truly powerful." Jaylen nodded slightly. "Thank you. Have you thought about what you'll do next?" he asked, his gaze gentle. Jaylen shrugged, speaking honestly. "I never planned any of this, it just happened. None of it was in my plans." Mr. Crawford smiled. "Usually, the most beautiful things in life are the ones we don't expect." That night, Jaylen finally opened a message he had ignored all day, partly out of curiosity, partly because he felt something was waiting for him there. The message was from the new communications director of Northwind Air. The tone was completely different. No formulas, no avoidance, just sincerity. They acknowledged that the previous responses may not have addressed the emotional needs. And then the invitation. A face-to-face meeting with senior leadership. No press, no cameras, just a conversation. Because your story could help shape future policies. Jaylen read it twice. He wasn't naive. He knew the invitation could be a PR stunt, but what if it wasn't? What if this was truly an opportunity to end what he had experienced and prevent others from going through the same? The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Not in a grand conference room. No media present, just a simple meeting room with a long table and a few senior leaders. The air was heavy, not from disagreement, but because everyone knew they were facing something bigger than a passenger, a flight attendant, or a ticket. Jaylen spoke, not with anger, not with bitterness, just the truth, clear and sincere. I didn't make a scene, I wasn't being rebellious, I just sat in the seat I paid for, and just that was enough for someone to doubt me. One of the directors, seated across from him, nodded slowly. We've reviewed the video, and we've had a serious conversation with the crew. What happened completely goes against the values we publicly promote. Then he added, his voice deep. The issue may not be with the employees, but with how we define values. Perhaps we haven't communicated it clearly enough, causing them to think that behavior was acceptable. The room fell into silence until another person asked, "If you were in our position, what would you do differently?" Jaylen didn't respond immediately. He thought deeply and honestly because he knew if this was real, then his words needed to carry the weight of action. Start with retraining, he said, not just teaching the rules, but going deeper, learning to see the invisible like prejudice. It lies beneath the surface of policy, but it governs how people act. The room listened in silence. There needs to be a real process to hold people accountable. Jaylen continued. When someone crosses a line, don't wait until it's exposed online to respond, and don't make the passengers prove they deserve to be there. It's not their responsibility. It's yours, the people who created this system. The silence that enveloped the room, but this time it was the silence of listening. After the meeting, the airline sent Jaylen an offer, not a symbolic title, but an official position as an advisor in the Youth Council of the Diversity and Inclusion Department, a new step, not just for an apology, but for real change. That evening, another message slipped quietly through the stillness. An internal memo had been leaked. The information revealed that the flight crew members involved were under their final review. Drafts for policy changes were already being written. But Jaylen didn't speak up. He didn't post anything, didn't share another video, didn't react. Not because he was afraid, but because everything had now crossed a personal boundary. This was no longer his story. It had become a mirror, forcing thousands of people to look at themselves, and this time no one could look away. The storm had risen, growing stronger by the hour, and each new story shared added weight to that wave. Jaylen had never sought the spotlight, but his courageous silence had sparked a conversation, one that couldn't be extinguished by corporate apologies or empty statements from businesses. The name Jaylen Rivers spread across social media, podcasts, and news broadcasts. It wasn't just a name, it had become a symbol of resilience in silence, of courage that didn't need to shout. Even those who hadn't heard the full story felt something deep when they mentioned his name. But amidst the whirlwind of public opinion, Jaylen was still just a teenager going to school, still facing math tests, writing essays, gym class, and the strange looks from classmates. Some people looked at him as if he were a celebrity. Others were cautious, unsure of what to say. One day, after school, Mr. Crawford, the history teacher, approached him with a concerned expression. "I just wanted to say how much I admired your interview," he said, "the way you kept your composure. It was truly powerful." Jaylen nodded slightly. "Thank you. Have you thought about what you'll do next?" he asked, his gaze gentle. Jaylen shrugged, speaking honestly. I never planned any of this. It just happened. None of it was in my plans." Mr. Crawford smiled. "Usually, the most beautiful things in life are the ones we don't expect." That night, Jaylen finally opened a message he had ignored all day, partly out of curiosity, partly because he felt something was waiting for him there. The message was from the new communications director of Northwind Air. The tone was completely different. No formulas, no avoidance, just sincerity. They acknowledged that the previous responses may not have addressed the emotional needs. And then the invitation. A face-to-face meeting with senior leadership. No press, no cameras, just a conversation. Because your story could help shape future policies, Jaylen read it twice. He wasn't naive. He knew the invitation could be a PR stunt. But what if it wasn't? What if this was truly an opportunity to end what he had experienced and prevent others from going through the same? The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Not in a grand conference room. No media present. Just a simple meeting room with a long table and a few senior leaders. The air was heavy, not from disagreement, but because everyone knew they were facing something bigger than a passenger, a flight attendant, or a ticket. Jaylen spoke, not with anger, not with bitterness. Just the truth, clear and sincere. I didn't make a scene, I wasn't being rebellious. I just sat in the seat I paid for. And just that was enough for someone to doubt me. One of the directors, seated across from him, nodded slowly. "We've reviewed the video, and we've had a serious conversation with the crew. What happened completely goes against the values we publicly promote." Then he added, his voice deep. "The issue may not be with the employees, but with how we define values. Perhaps we haven't communicated it clearly enough, causing them to think that behavior was acceptable." The room fell into silence, until another person asked, "If you were in our position, what would you do differently?" Jaylen didn't respond immediately. He thought deeply and honestly because he knew. If this was real, then his words needed to carry the weight of action. Start with retraining. He said, "Not just teaching the rules, but going deeper, learning to see the invisible like prejudice. It lies beneath the surface of policy, but it governs how people act." The room listened in silence. There needs to be a real process to hold people accountable. Jaylen continued, "When someone crosses a line, don't wait until it's exposed online to respond, and don't make the passengers prove they deserve to be there. It's not their responsibility. It's yours, the people who created this system." The silence that enveloped the room. But this time it was the silence of listening. After the meeting, the airline sent Jaylen an offer, not a symbolic title but an official position as an advisor in the Youth Council of the Diversity and Inclusion Department. A new step, not just for an apology but for real change. A few days later, Jaylen received a call. It wasn't from the press, nor from the lawyers, or even from the executives. It was from someone who had been quietly following everything from afar. His father. The man with a single call had turned an entire flight around, not out of anger, but because he knew when to speak up and when to let others stand on their own. That's when Jaylen realized it was time to call back. He wasn't avoiding anymore. Despite the hundreds of messages, the countless interview requests, there was only one person whose response weighed heavily on his heart throughout all these days. Since the incident, his father, Malcolm Rivers, had remained silent. Not because he didn't care, but because of the subtle silence of a father quietly watching every step his son took, giving him the space to grow on his own. The call connected after 2 rings. The familiar, warm voice came through, making Jaylen's heart tighten. "I've been waiting." Not knowing when you'd call, Jaylen hesitated, but his father continued, his voice full of reflection. "I've thought a lot about it, and honestly, I'm proud." There was a silence between them, but this time it was a warm silence. Jaylen spoke softly but firmly. "You trusted I'd handle it. So why did you still call Malcolm?" Didn't rush to answer. He took a slow breath. "There's a big difference between making noise and truly making an impact." He said, "You took the first step. I just made sure the rest happened the way it needed to." Jaylen paused. He'd never thought his father had been watching so closely. "I've always been watching you, but I only intervene when you're treated as if you don't belong there." He stopped, letting the words sink in. "And this is no longer just your story, Jaylen. It's the story of so many others. It's heartbreaking that you were misjudged just for staying calm and composed. They treated you as if you were the problem, even though you clearly did nothing wrong." Jaylen let his father's words echo in his mind. That statement wasn't just about a single moment. It was the resonance of hundreds of similar situations where silence was seen as weakness and prejudice was considered the norm. You had every right to be there. Malcolm continued, his voice calm yet firm, "And I had a good reason to make that call, to make them understand they were facing something bigger than they realized." Jaylen looked up. "So, who exactly were they really facing?" "Dad." Malcolm chuckled lightly, a warm laugh without any arrogance. Someone they definitely wouldn't want to upset. The truth was, Jaylen's father had never flaunted his power. He didn't appear on television, didn't write op-eds. He worked quietly behind the scenes in advisory boards where decisions were made behind closed doors, where real influence began. When he called Northwind Air, there were no threats of lawsuits. No big names were invoked. He simply stated the truth in a calm yet irrefutable voice. "My son paid for the seat, followed the rules. But you pushed him out of that seat, not because of a technical mistake, but because of a personal judgment." And then he said directly, "You're stopping the wrong plane. If you don't want this story told by someone with a much louder voice, you should have the courage to admit your mistake right now." Northwind Air responded quickly, too quickly. Before Jaylen even returned to the terminal, the flight had been turned around. The crew had been suspended, and an official internal investigation had begun. But within Jaylen there wasn't just gratitude, there was deep curiosity. "Did you ever think it would go this far?" Jaylen asked. Malcolm pondered. "I knew this could go far, but I also understood this was never my story. That's why I stepped back. You didn't need me to speak for you. You just needed space for your own voice to be heard." He lowered his voice, almost whispering. "And you did it, beyond what I could ever imagine. Not shouting, not resisting. You just stood firm with the truth, and sometimes that's what breaks the rot." They talked for a long time, about what was to come. Not just about the airline, but Jaylen's own story, how his next steps would unfold, and how to ensure he wouldn't be drowned out by it all. In the days that followed, the invitations kept coming. Schools wanted him to speak. Workshops reached out. Companies offered scholarship support, internship opportunities. The press sought exclusive interviews. But Jaylen began to feel afraid. Not afraid of the responsibility, but afraid of being turned into a brand. I don't want to be the name that gets slapped onto a campaign. Jaylen sighed. I don't want to be a brand. Malcolm looked at his son. Then don't be a voice. Speak only when your heart truly wants to speak, not because others expect you to. That advice stayed with Jaylen like a guiding light. A few days later, Northwind Air launched a new campaign. It wasn't grandiose. It wasn't loud. Just a humble commitment to put responsibility first instead of trying to salvage their reputation. They released an internal report compiling passenger complaints, categorizing them specifically. They opened up an anonymous feedback portal for passengers to voice their concerns without fear of being ignored. Jaylen wasn't mentioned in that campaign. There were no photos with executives, no PR speeches. But that didn't bother him because for the first time actions came before appearances. Meanwhile, he returned to class with essays to write, gym sessions to attend, and the occasional odd looks from classmates. Some days, everything felt as distant as a dream. Other days, it weighed so heavily it was hard to breathe, because carrying the attention of society when you're just a boy is never easy. One quiet evening, while reading the news on his phone, Jaylen came across a small headline from a local newspaper in another state. A teenager asked to leave first-class prompts, airline to change policy. It wasn't a big deal. It didn't cause a media frenzy. But there was an airline in another place that quietly looked at Jaylen's story and decided it had to change. No one had asked for it. Jaylen set his phone down. His heart quietly stirred. He understood. At that moment, Jaylen realized everything he had been through wasn't just about one airline, one flight, or a quiet moment. It was a chain reaction. A small action, simply staying in his seat, had shaken an entire system. But it wasn't the end, because there was still one person whose voice Jaylen had yet to hear. The woman who made this story happen. The one who made a decision in the blink of an eye and changed the world. She, the flight attendant that day, finally spoke up. Not through the media, not on the news, but through an email quietly slipping into Jaylen's student inbox, forwarded by an administrator who was still unsure how to handle it. The subject line was brief. I need to share something important. Jaylen didn't open it immediately, but from the sender's name that appeared, he knew it was her. There were no legal terms, no veiled statements, just a straightforward, raw, and vulnerable voice. A voice that stripped away the authority, the right and wrong. Jaylen stared at the screen, took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid, but there was an unusual weight. It felt as though the words to come might unleash all the emotions he had been holding back. Finally, he clicked. I don't know if these words will reach you. I'm not sure I deserve to write to you, but I need to say this. Something I couldn't say that day. Every word was written with all the courage she could muster. There was no justification, no blaming the situation, the work pressure, or anything else. When I saw you sitting there, I couldn't help but think, maybe you shouldn't be sitting in that seat. Not because of your clothes, not because of your voice, just because of what I thought about a first-class passenger. I was wrong. That was my prejudice, and it hurt you more than I ever understood. Jaylen read that part 3 times. Each time it felt like another layer of emotion was peeled away. There were no words to shield it. No excuses. Just the truth. She continued explaining that she had been in the job for 16 years, believing she knew how to understand people, believing she was fair. But in that moment, she failed. You taught me something profound, that one can hold the truth with calmness, without anger, without fierce reactions. I'm not sure I could have done the same if our positions had been reversed. She spoke of the time after the incident being suspended. Beginning therapy, signing up for classes she had always postponed. Not because the airline required it, but because her conscience urged her. My actions weren't just wrong. They caused pain. I didn't act with clarity. Easy assumptions can lead to deep hurt. There were no pleas for forgiveness, no desire for a response, just one final line. I don't expect to erase my mistake. I just hope one thing, that my words can reach you. Jaylen sat still. He stayed there for hours, writing and erasing, writing and erasing. Dozens of drafts were never sent. Finally, he sent just one sentence. I've received your words, and I hope others can hear them too. Not a plea for forgiveness, not a reassurance, just an acknowledgement. A way for her to know that Jaylen had listened and what she needed, the truth. The recognition had reached where it needed to go. No one needed to be punished. No dramatics. It was just for a person for the first time to be seen clearly, fully, not reduced to prejudice. The letter didn't erase the old memories, but it changed the atmosphere around those memories forever. When responsibility comes from within, not because of public pressure, not because of fear, but because of a genuine awakening, its value surpasses any news headline or apology campaign. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Not just at the airline, but in how schools, the media, and even strangers began to view Jaylen. The story was no longer just about an injustice. It had now become a symbol of a deeper truth, that calmness, steadiness without noise, is sometimes the thing that can shake an entire system without breaking it. One bright morning, Jaylen received an invitation to join a forum for student leaders. At first, he almost turned it down, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want to be forever labeled as the boy on the plane. But then a quiet change began to sprout within Jaylen. Not because he wanted fame, not because he needed to be honored, but because he needed to understand himself. On the stage, he didn't speak directly about the flight. He didn't mention the airline. He didn't need to recount every detail. He simply began with a small story seemingly unrelated. People often think that strength lies in words, but I've realized it also lies in the things we choose not to say. When we remain calm, not reacting as others expect, our presence becomes something they cannot ignore. The room fell silent, not a sound, but everyone was listening with their hearts. Jaylen was sharing a part of his soul. He wasn't teaching them anything. He was simply giving them a path to find their own voice. When he stepped off the stage, an older man approached him. His hair was peppered with gray, and his voice was gentle. I was on that flight. Jaylen paused for a moment. Really, I saw everything I wanted to speak up, but at that time I couldn't. I felt paralyzed. Every day since I've thought about that moment, I need you to know your actions changed everything. Jaylen stood still, not because of the praise, but because it was living proof that silence can also create waves. Not the kind of waves that drown, but the slow, steady waves that can move something deep inside. And those waves were still spreading. Then a surprising call came, not from a journalist, not from the airline, but from the U.S. Department of Transportation, specifically the Civil Rights Division. The voice on the other end was calm, without any fanfare, They asked if Jaylen would be willing to take some time to speak with them directly. Not to testify, just an honest conversation. Before Jaylen could respond, his mother, still standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, looked at him and whispered, "They don't call unless they really care." And indeed, they cared in a way that made Jaylen's heart race. He walked into the federal building not as the main character, but as someone carrying a story that needed to be told. No media, no cameras, just a young man with one simple question. What can we do to make sure this never happens again? They listened, truly listened. Jaylen recounted every detail of that day. No dramatization, no embellishment, just the truth. Each piece of memory strung together in a steady voice but heavy with emotion. When she looked at my ticket like I was doing something wrong, I felt judged. Not because I did something wrong, but because I didn't look like the image she had of a first-class passenger. He talked about the feeling when all eyes in the cabin seemed to focus on him. Not because he caused trouble, but simply because he refused to stand up. He spoke of the silence that was used like a verdict, and he allowed that room to be enveloped by that silence as a way for them to feel it too. In that moment, Jaylen shared the feelings he had long kept bottled up. It wasn't just about a flight anymore. It was the feeling of stepping into a space and immediately feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. It was the invisible yet familiar weight having to prove that you deserved to be there. Every single time. He spoke about how young people like him grew up with a quiet reminder. Speak softer, walk slower. Don't stand out too much just to avoid being seen as a threat. The room fell silent. Then a brave representative spoke up. We truly empathize. And the way you navigated this with calm and wisdom is something we deeply respect. They didn't come to Jaylen to apologize, not because they needed to make a public display, but because they wanted him to help build a real solution. Not just a few sensitivity training sessions, but a deep, meaningful program. One where airline staff wouldn't just learn to recognize bias, but would be forced to confront it. Jaylen agreed, but not immediately. He needed time to think, because if he joined, it had to be for the truth, not because someone needed to attach his name to a campaign. And then, over the following weeks, Jaylen worked tirelessly with a small group. Among them were civil rights experts, transportation leaders, former flight attendants who had faced discrimination, and airline representatives. Together, they created a special training module. It didn't start with numbers or theories. It started with Jaylen's story. Not to make anyone feel guilty, but to awaken empathy, to spark self-reflection. They showed a raw, haunting video. Real stories, examples that didn't shout, but still carried power because prejudice isn't loud. It wears a professional suit, smiles politely, and then quietly hurts. The module was approved for trial by 5 major airlines in the U.S., including the airline that had pushed Jaylen out of his seat. Not because they feared being sued, but because they knew this loss could not be denied, and they couldn't keep avoiding it. As things slowly returned to normal, Jaylen went back to school, to his friends, and to the college applications he once thought he wasn't worthy of submitting. But the biggest change was how people saw him. Not just as the boy who stayed seated, but as the person who stopped a flight and then helped rebuild the runway from the ashes. Of course, not everyone supported him. On social media, there were still those who said, "You should have just given up the seat and moved on." He stayed silent. No need to rebut his existence. the change in the system was the answer already. Now, every time Jaylen boarded a plane, he felt something different. Not because the world had suddenly become kinder, but because the next child who sits in first class won't have to bow their head to be recognized anymore. And if it still happens, there will be a clear process. Proper training. A system that knows how to listen. Not avoid all of this, thanks to a quiet teenager who simply chose to stay seated in his rightful place. Then came a special seminar where industry leaders, activists, airline executives, even the U.S. Secretary of Transportation were all present. After the formal speeches, all eyes turned to Jaylen. One of the moderators asked, "Do you have anything you'd like to share?" Jaylen looked around the dimly lit room, his heart racing. He knew everyone was waiting for something. He took a breath and responded, "I never intended to become a symbol. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else. If our system only serves those who are the loudest, the wealthiest, or those who fit the existing standards, then that's not a system. It's just a mirror, reflecting privilege. And it's time we change the image in that mirror." The room erupted in applause, not out of politeness, not out of formality, but because a truth had been spoken by the voice of a young person. The mirror only reflects privilege. It's time we change what we see. When Jaylen finished that sentence, the room fell into silence before waves of applause slowly rose like a tide, eventually becoming a resounding cheer. Not for the formality, but because of the undeniable truth he had just spoken. In the back row, a woman quietly stood watching. No more uniform, no more badge, no more mask of power, just her, an ordinary person continuing her journey of learning. And perhaps that was more valuable than any apology. Change doesn't come from a rule book. It begins when people courageously face the broken pieces inside themselves. The months that followed weren't filled with television broadcasts or social media posts, but they were quieter, more certain than any shockwave. At airports across the United States, small conversations began to emerge. At check-in counters, staff hesitated before saying the familiar line about seats being reserved. The flight crews began to question their own beliefs. People who had never been scrutinized before now saw the invisible walls that had been built around them all along. Jaylen remained calm. Interviews poured in, scholarships flooded in universities everyone called him a hero. But he just smiled. "I just spoke the truth, and I didn't leave my seat." He graduated from high school on time, his grades, the result of his hard work and the proud looks from teachers as he walked up to accept his diploma, a teenager whose impact went far beyond the classroom. Then, one day, Jaylen received a scholarship from a small college, but one with a big vision. No one asked him about the incident on the plane more than once. They only asked, "What can we learn from your experience?" At 20, Jaylen became a co-author of a nationally influential policy guide requiring airlines to report complaints based on race, age, and passenger status. No more avoiding, no more hiding. And that wasn't all. He also founded a mentorship program for young people of color, with dreams of soaring not just as passengers but as pilots, engineers, policymakers, or flight attendants. He told them, "Don't just get on the plane. Learn to fly it. Don't just follow the manual. Rewrite it with your own hands." And they did. Jaylen's story was no longer a controversial incident. It had become a flame spreading through classrooms, lecture halls, and cockpits. Then, one quiet evening, Jaylen sat reading a handwritten letter, not an email, not a message. It was a letter from a stranger. a young boy who had quietly followed Jaylen's journey from afar with both admiration and hope. The letter read, "I used to be so scared to fly, not because of the plane, but because of what might happen to me while I was on it. One time I was held back just for laughing too loud while listening to music. They said I was causing a disturbance. I didn't do anything wrong. But when I saw you, I knew I didn't have to apologize for my existence anymore." Jaylen folded the letter. He said nothing, but tears quietly fell. No need for accolades, no need for medals. Just one child feeling safer in the sky, and everything he had done was worth it. If one day they make you leave your seat, you won't need to shout. You just need to stay calm and know that you belong there. Jaylen folded the letter and gently placed it behind his journal, not to record the pain, but to record his growth. The journal thickened over the years, not with pages soaked in tears, but with small yet monumental victories. There were victories in a flight attendant pausing to think before judging someone. There were victories in a black family walking into first class without being scrutinized. And there were larger victories such as airlines announcing their annual restructuring progress, not to receive applause, but to keep the promise they made to themselves. Jaylen knew he had tied his life to something irreversible, a decision that seemed simple. Staying in his seat not only stopped a plane, but also forced an entire industry to land to face reality. Many years later, at a peaceful airport, Jaylen sat by the window, his headphones enclosing him in his own world, his backpack resting on his foot, and a first-class ticket in hand. No more scrutinizing glances, no more whispers, no more furrowed brows when his boarding pass was checked. When the gate opened, he walked like everyone else, not to stand out, but to affirm, "I have always deserved to be here." And now the world knows that this is not a story about rebellion. This is a story about steadfastness. A young black teenager was asked to leave his first-class seat, but instead of anger, he chose to stay. Chose to make a phone call, chose to hold his ground, and from there changed an entire system. With the quiet yet powerful support of his father, a man who wields influence not for fame, but for responsibility, Jaylen made an entire industry look at itself again. And when looking at today's American society, where prejudice and injustice still exist daily, that story becomes a powerful reminder. We don't need to scream to be heard, we need to stand firm. Speak the truth and let calmness speak for everything. The greatest lesson is not in the first-class ticket, but in the fact that when you witness injustice at work, at school, or in your community, speak up in a positive way, dialogue, report, share your story, and support those unheard voices. And if you can become the one who listens, not everyone can touch the sky, but, as Jaylen proved, as long as you don't leave your seat, the world will be forced to change position. There are stories that don't need loud shouts to shake the world. There are moments when, with just one small action, like a boy's firm decision to not leave his seat, an entire system that seemed unchangeable can be shaken. The story you've just witnessed is not just about a flight or discrimination. It's a profound lesson about perseverance, dignity, and courage in silence. Jaylen didn't try to become a symbol, but by not trying, he became an inspiration to millions. Perhaps within each of us there have been moments of choice: stand up or stay seated, ignore or speak out. And sometimes it's the silence with purpose, the calm with conviction that brings about true change. This story doesn't encourage anger, nor does it promote confrontation. It reminds us that change doesn't always come from noise, but sometimes it begins with one young person who stays exactly where they belong, with a valid ticket and a heart unwilling to retreat. If you felt something in this story, a touch of emotion, a sense of empathy, or simply an appreciation for what's right, then share this video, because perhaps the awakening you just felt is exactly what someone out there needs to hear. Don't forget to to support stories like this that carry human values. Share this video with your friends so that together we can build a community free from judgment, where everyone can step into the first class of their life with dignity and without fear of doubt. And if you enjoy inspiring emotional stories that leave a lasting impact, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any emotional journey we will share with you. Because this world doesn't change with the loudest calls. It changes through those who dare to hold their ground in silence, but with both heart and mind. Thank you for watching. See you in the next stories.